done by Lucy Missa and Taylor Aldrich were inspired by two books, The Warmth of Other Suns and Homegoing. And so we have poets here today who are going to read excerpts from the book. And we're going to start with Scheherazade, and she's going to read the excerpt that that resonated with her, that reflected home. And then afterwards, we'll have a conversation about the exhibition and about the text. Thanks.
Yay.
Hi.
Hello.
So, thank you, Taylor and Lucy and DIA and Sharon for considering me for this. I had not read the book prior, and so that was an amazing read, and I read off of that still. There were so many excerpts, right, that it took me a while to settle on one. So let's go. This is from The Warmth of Other Suns. She kept her head up and held his hand tight and walked through it. He could never defend her, never stand up to a gang of them on a street corner. That was death, he would say years later. Pershing knew it from the sheer insanity all around him. When he was 11 years old, a white mob burned down the courthouse across the border in Sherman, Texas. It started with a colored man accused of raping a white woman, confession extracted, a trial hastily set. But just as the trial opened, a mob stormed the courtroom and torched the building to get the defendant, George Hughes. Court officials fled through a second-story window and left Hughes in a steel vault with a bucket of water. Firefighters tried to save the courthouse, but the mob slashed the water hoses to keep the blaze going. The mob then dynamited the vault where Hughes had been left. The mob found him dead, crushed by the explosion, the water bucket almost empty. The courthouse then burned to the ground. Disappointed that they had not gotten to Hughes before he died, the people in the mob hanged his body from a cottonwood tree and set it on fire with furniture they looted from a nearby colored hotel. Then they torched the colored district as the colored people of Sherman fled to the homes of white friends or left town. A half dozen colored homes escaped the torching only because a white man told the mob the houses belonged to him. This was the world Pershing was growing up in. He had learned the rules early in life. Now, he was standing at a vacant curb, just him and a white man out prowling. He had never seen the man before, imagined he must have come in front of the country and made a beeline for the colored section with one thing in mind, as was his prerogative. Not just any colored girl, a nice, clean colored girl. The man waited and Pershing assessed the situation. He was on the colored side of town, a block from the rooming house. He knew every turn and alley. He was in the majority around here. He looked at the man. A nice, clean colored girl, he said, calculating the risk of what he might say next. Let me see. I'll tell you what. You get your mama for me, and I'll get you one. He didn't wait for the man's reaction. Pershing vanished into the colored alleys of Five Points. He couldn't believe what had come out of his mouth. His face was flushed and his hands shook. He could get hanged for that. Nothing more needed to happen to remind him who had the power over him and what they could do if they wanted. You lived with it. But it wasn't, you lived with it, Pershing said years later. But it wasn't that you liked the taste of it. And I'd whisper to myself that someday the sun was going to shine down on me. Way up north in Chicago or Kansas City, or one of those other faraway places that my cousin always talked about. I felt the same restlessness in me. Mahalia Jackson, moving on up. The South, 1915 to the 1970s. At Easter and around the 4th of July, the people from the North came. They looked like extras out of a movie at Saturday matinee. They wore peplums and bergamot waves. Even the wind moved aside as they walked. They flashed thick rolls of cash from their pockets, the the biggest bills on the outside covering the ones and fives. They said that they were making all kinds of money, but they didn't have to say it because the cars and the clothes did the talking. They had been wiring more money to their families back home than they truly could spare and had been saving up all year for those gloves and that matching purse. But they weren't telling the people in the South that. They made sure to show up at their mother churches where everyone would see them. At Gethsemane Baptist Church in Eustis, Florida, where little George went. At Thankful Baptist Church in Rome, Georgia, where my mother saw the people visiting from the north. At New Hope Baptist Church in Chickasaw County, Mississippi, where Ida Mae lived. Even at Zion Traveler Baptist Church in Monroe, Louisiana, where Pershing grew up, the partisans set aside their rivalries and sat upright in pews when the people from the north came. The pastor would ask the visitors to rise, and it was then that the people from up north or out west stood up in their butterfly hats and angel dresses and in suits upholstered to the tall men's frames. People who hadn't seen them in ages now craned their necks to see how Willie and Thelma looked and if they had changed any. And the pastor went on about how this was one building cars in Detroit and that one was doing us proud in Oakland. They were received like visiting dignitaries. They had once been just like the people who stayed. Now, they were doing important sounding work for the government in Washington, in the hotels on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, in the Garment District in New York, or in the apartments of the rich people on Riverside Drive. They wore protective clothing of the North. They lived in big cities, too distracted to care what the colored people did, as long as they did it to themselves. And that was the greatest blessing of all. Ida Mae soon discovered that when it came to white people, there were good ones and bad ones like anything else, and that she had to watch them close to figure out the difference. She was too good-natured to waste energy disliking them no matter what they did, but looked upon them as a curiosity she might never comprehend. She learned to give them the benefit of the doubt, but not be surprised at anything involving them. This alone probably added decades to her life. A white lady named Miss Julie McClenna lived across the pasture, and she was nice to Ida Mae. After Ida Mae's father died, Miss McClenna paid Ida Mae to gather up eggs in the hen house. Sometimes she took her into town to help her carry eggs to sell. She gave Ida Mae live chickens and leftover food, knowing that Ida Mae's mother had just been left a widow. After school, Ida Mae walked a mile to the big house across the pasture to gather eggs for Miss McClenna in the evenings. She always hoped for a lot of eggs. If there were too many for Miss McClenna to carry herself, she would take Ida Mae into Oklahoma with her. It was the only chance Ida Mae got to go into town. Ida Mae gathered more than usual one time, and Miss McClenna took her into Oklahoma to help her sell them to the white people in town. They delivered the eggs to customers' houses, straight to their doors, and Miss McClenna had Ida Mae carry the basket of eggs for her. The day had gone well until they knocked on one woman's door to make a delivery. Ida Mae stood with the basket behind Miss McClenna as Miss McClenna prepared to step inside. "You can't bring that nigga in," the woman said from her front door as soon as she saw Ida Mae. Miss McClenna knew what that meant. She motioned for Ida Mae to go to the back door to deliver the eggs while Miss McClenna stepped inside to complete the transaction. On the way back home, Miss McClenna seemed unsettled by it. "Did you hear what she called you?" Miss McClenna asked Ida Mae. "Yeah, but I ain't paying no attention," Ida Mae said. "They call you so many names. I never paid no attention." The incident jarred Miss McClenna. The hardware of reality rattled her, as the artist Carrie Mae Weems would say later of such interactions. What few people seem to realize, or perhaps dare to admit, was that the thick walls of the caste system kept everyone in prison. The rules that defined a group's supremacy were so tightly wound as to put pressure on everyone trying to stay within the narrow confines of acceptability. It meant being a certain kind of Protestant, holding a particular occupation, having a respectable level of wealth or the appearance of it, and drawing the patronizingly appropriate lines between oneself and those of lower rank of either race in that world. An attorney's wife in Alabama, for instance, was put on notice one day at a gathering at her home for the upper-class women in her circle. Between the hors d'oeuvres and conversation, one of the club women noticed, for the first time apparently, a statuette of the Virgin Mary on a cabinet in the hostess's living room. The guest cattily remarked upon it. Why, she never knew the hostess and her family were Catholics. The attorney's wife was shaken by the accusation and quickly replied that, of course not, they were Methodists, and she thought everyone knew that. She only had that statuette because she happened to like it. But after the party was over and the guests were gone, the accusation haunted her, and she fretted over the implication that she might be seen as a member of a lesser tribe. That day, the attorney's wife took down the statuette of Mary that she liked so much and put it away for good. She could not afford even the appearance of having stepped outside of the bounds of her caste. And neither could Miss Julie McClellan. As far as Ida Mae knew, Miss McClellan never sold eggs to that lady again. But that was also the end of her brief employment with Miss Julie McClellan at the end of the trips into Oklahoma. She never did take me no more after that, Ida Mae said. In the bottoms, where Ida Mae grew up, it was a crazy enough world that they could almost time the weekends by a white farmer who lived down the road. He was fine when he was sober and actually liked colored people, but he got drunk on Fridays and came staggering on his old horse to the colored people's cabins. They could hear the hoof steps and hollering as he rode in, waving his gun. "I'm coming through," he shouted. Grown people dropped their buckets and went running. Children hid under the cabins on the dirt floor between the stilts while he huffed and cussed and tried to smoke them out. "I'ma shoot y'all," he hollered. "I'ma kill y'all." There was always a commotion and a panic whenever he came through. It could happen day or night. There was never much warning, and they had to scramble to escape his ragged gunshots. Then they had to lie perfectly still. We'd run under the house, and wherever he heard a bump, he would shoot, Ida Mae said. One day when he came through, Ida Mae was outside and couldn't get under the house in time. Josie and Tama had scattered already, and she didn't see where they had gone. The man had wobbled off his horse and was coming through, firing his gun. A barrel of cornmeal was right next to her. She saw it and jumped inside. She sank into the great cushion of meal with her chin digging into her knees. All the while, the man hollered and grunted around her, and the bullets made the pinging noises of metal against tin. She pulled the top over her head and tried not to breathe. She stayed in the barrel until the shooting and the cussing stopped. He was drunk and a bad aim and never actually hit anybody as far as Ida Mae knew. No sheriff or police were ever called in. There would have been no point in calling. And so the drunk farmer could go on shooting and scaring the Brandons and other colored people in the bottoms whenever he felt like it. He called himself having fun, Ida Mae said. But as she grew older, she learned that there was more to the Southern caste system than verbal slights and antics of a crazy white farmer. In the summer of 1926, when she was 13, a cloud passed over the grown people, and it showed in their faces. She could overhear them whispering about something that had happened in town, some terrible thing they didn't want the children to know about. It had to do with two colored boys, the Carter brothers as she heard it, and a white woman. They had said something to the white lady, she said. And as best as Ida Mae could make out, the white people had taken the boys and hanged them in Oklahoma that morning. Ida Mae would always remember it because that was the day her cousin was born, and they named the baby Thenia after Ida Mae's mother. The grown people wept in their cabins. After the funeral, the surviving Carters packed up and left Mississippi. They went to a place called Milwaukee and never came back. In 3 years' time, Ida Mae and George would move to the Pearson plantation, and things would unfold in such a way that Ida Mae would eventually follow the Carters up north. Although she didn't see how it might apply to herself at the time. The Carter migration was a signal to Ida Mae that there was, in fact, a window out of the asylum.
So we have another poet here from Cleveland, Ohio, and Sierra Freeman, and she is going to do some excerpts from Homegoing.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for allowing me to read some of this greatness that you produced. The night Afia Ultra was born into the musky heat of Fantaland, a fire raged through the woods just outside her father's compound. It moved quickly, tearing a path for days. It lived off the air. It slept in caves and hid in trees. It burned up and through, unconcerned with what wreckage it left behind, until it reached Asante village. There, it disappeared, becoming one with the night. Afia's father, Kabe Ultra, left his first wife, Baba, with a new baby, so that he might survey the damage to his yams, that most precious crop known far and wide to sustain families. Kabe had lost 7 yams, and he felt each loss as a blow to his own family. He knew then that the memory of the fire that burned, then fled, would haunt him, his children, and his children's children for as long as the line continued. When he came back into Baba's hut to find Afia, the child of the night's fire, shrieking into the air, he looked at his wife and said, "We will never again speak of what happened today." The villagers began to say that the baby was born of the fire, that this was the reason Baba had no milk. Afia was nursed by Kabe's second wife, who had just given birth to a son 3 months before. Afia would not latch on, and when she did, her sharp gums would tear at the flesh around the woman's nipples until she became afraid to feed the baby. Because of this, Afia grew thinner, skin on small bird-like bones, with a large black hole of a mouth that expelled a hungry cry which could be heard throughout the village. Even on the days Baba did her best to smother it, covering the baby's lips with the rough palm of her left hand. "Love her," Kabe commanded, as though love were as simple an act as lifting food up from an iron plate and past one's lips. At night, Baba dreamed of leaving the baby in the dark forest so the god Naimi could do with her as he pleased. Afia grew older. The summer after her 3rd birthday, Baba had her first son. The boy's name was Fifi, and he was so fat that sometimes when Baba wasn't looking, Afia would roll him along the ground like a ball. The first day that Baba let Afia hold him, she accidentally dropped him. The baby bounced on his buttocks, landed on his stomach, and looked up at everyone in the room, confused as to whether or not he should cry. He decided against it. But Baba, who had been stirring banku, lifted her stirring stick and beat Afia across her bare back. Each time the stick lifted off the girl's body, it would leave behind hot, sticky pieces of banku that burned into her flesh. By the time Baba had finished, Afia was covered with sores, screaming and crying. From the floor, rolling this way and that on his belly, Fifi looked at Afia with his saucer eyes, but made no noise. Kabe came home to find his other wives attending to Afia's wounds and understood immediately what had happened. He and Baba fought well into the night. Afia could hear them through the thin walls of the hut where she lay on the floor, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. In her dream, Kabe was a lion and Baba was a tree. The lion plucked the tree from the ground where it stood and slammed it back down. The tree stretched its branches in protest, and the lion ripped them off one by one. The tree, horizontal, began to cry red ants that traveled down the thin cracks between its bark. The ants pulled on the soft earth around the top of the tree trunk. And so the cycle began. Baba beat Afia. Kabe beat Baba. By the time Afia had reached age 10, she could recite a history of the scars on her body. The summer of 1764, when Baba broke yams across her back. The spring of 1767, when Baba bashed her left foot with a rock, breaking her big toe so that now it always pointed away from the other toes. For each scar on Afia's body, there was a companion scar on Baba's. But that didn't stop the mother from beating daughter, father from beating mother. I just wanted to read a little bit more from this passage, if that's okay. Okay, because I really like where it did this time. Matters were only made worse by Afia's blossoming beauty. When she was 12, her breast arrived. 2 lumps that sprung from her chest as soft as mango flesh. The men of the village knew that first blood would soon follow, and they waited for the chance to ask Baba and Kabe for her hand. The gift started. One man tapped palm wine better than anyone else in the village, but another's fishing nets were never empty. Kabe's family feasted off of Afia's burgeoning womanhood. Their bellies, their hands were never empty. In 1775, Adwa Adu became the first girl of the village to be proposed to by one of the British soldiers. She was light-skinned and sharp-tongued. In the mornings, after she had bathed, she rubbed shea butter all over her body, underneath her breasts, and between her legs. Afia didn't know her well, but she had seen her naked one day when Baba sent her to carry palm oil to the girl's hut. Her skin was slick and shiny, her hair regal. The first time the white man came, Adwa's mother asked Afia's parents to show him around the village while Adwa prepared herself for him. "Can I come?" Afia asked, running after her parents as they walked. She heard Baba's no in one ear and Kabe's yes in the other, her father's ear one, and soon Afia was standing before the first white man she had ever seen. "He is happy to meet you," the translator said as the white man held his hand out to Afia. She didn't accept it. Instead, she hid behind her father's leg and watched him. He wore a coat that had shiny gold buttons down the middle. It strained against his paunch. His face was red, as though his neck were a stump on fire. He was fat all over and sweating, huge droplets from his forehead and above his bare lips. Afia started to think of him as a rain cloud, sallow and wet and shapeless. "Please, he would like to see the village," the translator said, and they all began to walk. They stopped first by Afia's own compound. "This is where we live," Afia told the white man, and he smiled at her dumbly, his green eyes hidden in fog. He didn't understand, even after his translator spoke to him. He didn't understand. Kabe held Afia's hand as he and Baba led the white man through the compound. "Here, in this village," Kabe said, "each wife has her own hut. This is the hut she shares with her children. When it is her husband's night to be with her, he goes to her in her hut." The white man's eyes grew clearer as the translation was given, and suddenly Afia realized that he was seeing through new eyes. The mud of her hut's walls, the straw of the roof, he could finally see them. They continued on through the village, showing the white man the town square, the small fishing boats formed from hollowed out tree trunks that the men carried with them. When they walked a few miles down the coast, Afia forced herself to see things through new eyes, too. She smelled the sea salt wind as it touched the hairs in her nose, felt the bark of a palm tree as sharp as a scratch, saw the deep, deep red of the clay that was all around her. her mother says so. A few weeks later, the white man came back to pay respects to Ottawa's mother, and Afia and all the other villagers gathered around to see what he would offer. There was the bride price of 15 pounds. There were goods he brought with him from the castle, carried on the back of Asante's. Kabe made Ifia stand behind him as they watched the servants come in with fabric, millet, gold, and iron. When they walked back to their compound, Kabe pulled Afia aside, letting his wives and other children walk in front of them. "Do you understand what just happened?" he asked her. In the distance, Baba slipped her hand into Fifi's. Afia's brother had just turned 11, but he could already climb up the trunk of a palm tree using nothing but his bare hands and feet for support.
I just want to start by thanking you, Sierra and Scheherazade, for speaking and reading today, and particularly choosing those excerpts. We gave the readers an opportunity to just read the book and choose what passages to read. But I really wanted to maybe ask you to your experience in reading these books. Were there any personal sort of themes or particular points in the novel that really spoke to you, or that you read that resonated with you in particular?
So many points in the novel. If you don't know, it's an epic, so it's 199,000 chapters.
I'm talking about Warmth of Other Suns.
Warmth of Other Suns, yes. And so the things that stood out most were the history and the detailings of these lynchings and these riots that had gone on in the past. In my current work, I'm working out. I'm responding to a couple of letters, and they deal very heavily with artwork, Emmett Till in particular. And so to get this type of
The work by
graphic,
Dana Schultz, or
yeah. And so to get this type of graphic detail about these lynchings was, it was heartbreaking, and it was gruesome, and I couldn't stop reading it. And not until it was that close in my face, did I really even internalize the levels of abuse, the levels of violence. I know that there is violence. I know that we have an experience of violence here, but it had been, whitewashed, and to read it in this graphic detail, and to think about the level of planning and preparation and dedication that goes into bringing harm and death to another life was, I'm still working, processing and working through that. What spoke to me most personally was Ida's story, and how it wasn't blatantly put out there in the book, but I saw her marriage as a personal migration. And having been married, I get it. I get to get away from my parents or whatever oppressive environment I'm in, and I'm going to be free, and I'm going to do this and that. And to read about what that looked like, particularly in that era, in that time, how the act of getting married was dangerous and not allowed. It could be stopped, and really it meant nothing in the South. Marriage offered no protection for the wife. Those two things, those two concepts kind of stood out for me, and they resonate deeply with me, and are actually few
Child of Blood and Bone, which is a fantastic, it's a fantastic book, right? It's about, it's magic, it's like all the things I wanted growing up, because I really was like a Harry Potter nerd, so it's like all the things I wanted, except also black, right? So when I incidentally got the offer to do this, and I had just finished up that section off of Blood and Bone, teaching them, some poetry off of the language that she used. And then I turned around and I got an opportunity to read this, and it was like almost going back to that place in Africa, which as a black girl, an African American, that's obviously always a secret want, a secret wish. Like, I want to be in Africa. So first and foremost, it let me go to Africa. That reading is a form of escapism, and I got to go back. I really, really am focused on familial ties in my own work, like how my father and my mother interacted, and how I interacted with my father as opposed to my mother, and just what those interactions look like and how they shape and form how I interact with other people. And I think it was very similar to Afia's story, which I found, like, one, very triggering, but also two, like, something that I know that can be written about well, because I've just read it written about well. And what I thought was interesting was it felt honest, and it didn't feel demonizing in a way that often when you're discussing parents or familial relationships, one parent is always automatically the demon. Like, obviously we know, like, the mom is not great to the daughter, but also there is this level of empathy and compassion that the author is almost forcing us to give to the mom, which we never really get, especially when it's black mothers and daughters. Like, I'm just also starting to realize I don't give my mother the type of compassion and empathy that she deserves, and like just the way this writer wrote it, I'm like, yeah, this isn't fair. But also as a Afia, like, what does your mother's life look like outside of your own lens? And I really like that. I also like the idea, which is something I realized from teaching a lot of, like, a primarily urban black youth, and a lot of my students are women, or young girls. I don't want to call them women, but they also don't want to be called girls. It's so weird. So whatever is in between woman and girl. Young lady, that's what we'll do. Yes, young lady. There'll be young ladies Monday. I can't wait. Okay. So the young ladies that I teach are entering womanhood, kind of like, that's also a part of why I wanted to read that second part. It's like coming of age stories are like some of my favorite stories, and very rarely do I get to see it done like quickly and concisely in a manner where I'm like, oh, that wasn't even long, but I felt like I grew up with her, like that idea of discovering yourself as a woman, like that moment where you kind of, my mother calls it smelling my own piss, but like that moment, like when you are like, I know that I am no longer a little girl. A lot of my teenagers are feeling that moment, and I felt like Afia was like looking like, I have these things. I'm about to, I see her shea butter in her body. Like the next thing is I want to do it next. And I also remember being that age when my friends started shaving their legs, and being pretty was more important than Pokemon cards. Like, it was just and I was always late, right? Because I was just like a very late bloomer. I like to read, like I was a little nerd. So like when everybody else was like deciding that this was the thing we were doing, I was like, sure, I want to participate, but also I want to watch y'all do it first and see like how this works out for you before I put my Pokemon cards away for good. And like I watched, and apparently I liked it because I got on the train. Like, I wanted to start becoming a woman, and I started talking to my friends about that. But that idea of watching another woman become a woman before you fully step into it, I think that's something that's kind of missing a lot from a lot of the coming of age stories in general. I'm like, no one discovers this on their own. Like, a lot of young women, and I think young men, like, we model ourselves after what we see, and the idea of how it was done in the book, I thought was like honest and fresh. Like, it was also reminiscent of what I know I did, so it felt very true. Obviously, the white man coming in to get lit, that was a lot.
Colonizer.
That was a lot.
Yeah.
I also had my students read over the excerpt, because I really like the language too. I think the word choices, as a poet, I really, really care about language and word choice, and I think that the author's word choice was phenomenal. So I had some of my students use the excerpt to make word banks, so they actually used some of the words from the novels to write in their poems later, and it was fun. They had fun. They enjoyed it too. And what I noticed, like, again, like what I noticed, like the language was really great. It was on point. And it was just honest. It all just felt like very much so authentic. And of course, it's not my experience, but like with that white man coming into play, I'm like, absolutely. Like that was absolutely the next path that I saw it coming, because obviously as an African American, I know it's coming, right? But I'm like, this is how, like when she just describes watching it, right? Like I'm like, yeah. The first time I really saw, I grew up in the projects of Cleveland, like in the King Kennedy projects, and I didn't see a white person in my face, like a real life one, until I was like 12. And I remember that, yeah, right? Right? No, and let me tell you, no, and I didn't have white teachers. Like it was very interesting. I did not have white teachers. I didn't have a white mailman. I didn't have, no. And it was, and the thing about, and I have a whole conversations, if anybody cares, about how secluded the projects are in Cleveland, how absolutely segregated we are. Like that is, it's not just my story. That is impossible. Like if you go now, you can meet a 10-year-old in the King Kennedy projects who can look at you and say, I've never seen a white person outside of television, outside of that type of interaction. So when I did, I got transferred to a gifted program and got into a school where my teachers were white. And I remember the first time like actually having to interact with a white person and just like noticing those differences, and like in the way that I don't pick apart black people, I was picking apart because it was foreign, not because I was hateful, just because I'd never seen it. And I felt like Afia did that same thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's a natural reaction. So I really just like how honest and natural this book.
I love how the author was able to tell us it's really like personal history, but also giving us like a larger, broader macro history of like the
narrative within a narrative
experience, and like grounding us in like that moment of when the colonizers and the Europeans came to West Africa and they infiltrated in various levels, not just like taking slaves through the Atlantic slave trade, but also marrying,
taking wives.
Yeah, taking wives and starting families in that way. And that was really insightful for me because I don't really hear a lot about that. But it allowed me or encouraged me to like do some more research about like the different ways that they colonized.
Yeah, because it was more than just coming and taking slaves.
Yeah.
I really like how like the parallels that you saw between your experience in Cleveland and in Homegoing, which are like totally different sides of the Atlantic. But also with Detroit came up in your reading, and I was wondering how you saw your own personal history, and did it inform your reading of the Great Migration?
Yes, I did not know. I did not know prior to reading that there was a passage that said you knew where in the South black people were from, like once they had migrated north. You knew where they were from just based on where they were. Because we are in Detroit, I know that we are from Mississippi and Georgia and Florida, because the railways would only take you to certain drop-off spots. So if you're in New York, that means that your people came from this part of the South. And if you're from Detroit, if you're claiming Detroit, 9 times 80% of the people before you, your forefathers came from, like I said, Georgia or Mississippi or Tallahassee. And so it gave me this insight as to how we got here. Where are you from? Where are you from? Like Detroit, Chicago? And now I feel like just knowing that gives me an entire history, like where you were from, what the conditions were that your, ancestors, forefathers had to deal with in getting here.
Yeah.
That was it.
No, but I agree with you. Like to your point, it's like, because I don't know how your grandparents are, your ancestors, or but my grandmother is very selfish with those histories, because I know that involved a lot of trauma. So she doesn't really talk a lot about life before Detroit. My other side of the family doesn't really talk about life before coming to Ohio, and it was very like relieving and satisfying to like read those vignettes, particularly in Warmth of Other Suns, and also in Homegoing, even the fictionalized stories, just to imagine like what those experiences were like for my grandmother, or my grandfather, and it really sort of made it palpable to my ancestral sort of experience.
I also find it interesting in my own head, like, Homecoming, right, seems to be the pre, and then Warmth of Other Suns is post. It's like, this is the colonization, this is what happens here in like right here.
This is what
But
happened.
once the transatlantic slave, once you get here to America, then this is what has happened. And this is the attitude, and this is what is expected. And, you know, this culture of dominance and this culture of superiority, and how it's seamless. It is absolutely seamless. And that, you know, I gotta be honest, after I read the book, listen, I was mad all over again.
Homegoing or Warmth of Suns?
Warmth of Other Suns. I was mad.
Yeah. The more you know, right?
Right?
Has
The
anyone
ignorance is bliss.
read these books, by the way?
I have Homegoing next on my books.
Okay, we won't spoil anything.
Yeah.
Because I was just about to talk about the ending.
I wanted to
but-
talk about the
No,
ending
do
too.
what you do. Do what you do.
Okay.
No.
You read Homegoing?
Homegoing, I haven't read the one.
Okay.
And we have plenty of books for sale.
Yes. Yes. Buy local. But if you don't mind us spoiling, I think it's important to just talk about the end of Homegoing, because it starts off with the two half-sisters who were separated by the slave trade. One marries this colonizer and one is sold into slavery, and the novel tracks the lineage of both women. And the book ends with the lineage, the people, the descendants, sort of meeting in the United States.
But you don't know how, so we didn't really
Yeah.
spoil it.
You'll still want to read it, 'cause it's
I've
phenomenal.
heard a similar story in real life, so
Yeah.
I'm good.
Really?
Yeah, so the Gullah people from South Carolina, there was a song that they had, and there was one particular word in the song. The language was Mende, which takes you to Sierra Leone, West Africa. There was one particular word in the song that they were able to trace that word and trace it directly to their family, because only their family used that word.
Wow.
So then they were able to travel to Sierra Leone and connect with their family. So you're not spoiling anything for me. That's a real story. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
There was a passage also in Warmth of Other Suns that Ida May had gotten to that point. She was in puberty, and the way it read was like, and the visitors would come, the callers were coming, and so every weekend there was just a new guy on the porch donning gifts and doing this and doing that. And then the one George, he came in and like shut it down.
Yeah.
So much so that her other callers were like, well, I better go because George is coming. But that's not the point. The point was that her mom was dead set, did not want her to marry him. She had it in her head that she too was going to marry this colonizer. Like, and she's like, I know she's not gonna like it, but no. So much so that she and George, like, they ran off, they eloped, they got married. She just came back like, well, no, that is not what happened. Somebody in town recognized her and came back and told the mom. But at that point, the mom was like, well, I guess if you're gonna run away, there's really nothing I can do.
Yeah.
But just that, like, decision making on the part of the parents, like, you're gonna go here or you're gonna go there, and her agency, even under that circumstance, like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
I think what struck me as the similarity between the passages you've read is just like sort of the intimate acts of violence, so like, and like the intersecting of these different balances of violence. So you have the familial violence, and then you have, you know, gender, you have race, you have imperialism, and they kind of, I feel like I don't really, when I think of particularly of Black women, it's, you kind of like lose, there's the possibility of like losing track of like just all the different kinds of violences that have been that they've had to experience. Yeah, so when you had read that are normalized, so when you had read
desensitized.
yeah, when you had read that kind of, that passage where Zafua, she can recall just by looking at her body when and where. She had a map, like this map of trauma.
I thought that was beautiful. Like, as a
Yeah.
poet, I just thought that was brilliant. Like,
Yeah.
for your body to be its own this is not my phone, this is my best friend's phone. Get your phone. Get your phone.
But why I gravitated to that is because there's like that larger story of imperialism and slavery, but then you have also, you know, at the most intimate, like where you assume would be the safest place is also violence. And I just wonder, I think about, you know, how do we navigate sort of,
Especially when it starts off often so young, like right in that case. It's like once you know violence, you grow up with violence, it's almost, I don't want to say easier, but it is to become desensitized to violence. Like it becomes less shocking, especially for Black women. And I think it's because we're used to, or we've been told, it's a you got to do it because you got to do it type of mentality, or this is what your mothers and grandmothers did, so what makes you better than them? Why shouldn't you have to go through it as well? A lot of internalized stuff, and I think it was like really interesting just to see how sometimes that doesn't start off in society. That starts off right at home.
And also being so accustomed to violence as environment, like this is my daily bread, right? That you don't know what to do in the absence of it. There is like no clue. There was a passage much later, Ida Mae was much older, and she was with her daughter or granddaughter, and they had gone back south. And they were riding past this plantation, this cotton plantation. And Ida was like, oh, let's go pick some cotton. And she was like, what? All this running. And it was ironic because when this was what was expected of her, when this was what her chore and job was, she was like, I don't do that. And really, I can't do that. She never made her quota. She's like, cotton picking ain't for me. I can cook, I can do these other things. And that she didn't have to. It was not her job. She was like, look at it's beautiful. Let's pick some cotton. And her granddaughter is like, that's not ours. You're gonna, what's gonna happen? We're gonna get in trouble. And she's like, oh, they won't mind this little bit of cotton we gonna pick. And it wound up being like, you know, maybe 50 pounds or something. But it was, she had done it with so much fervor and excitement, which was such an,
because she had the power
she
to
had the
decide.
power to decide
It's that Asian
without you know, punishment. And so I found that interesting how, and even now, even in my own personal life, how in the absence of certain stresses and traumas and dramas, you know, I don't know what to do. Like, you're okay. It takes me a minute to adjust to this, you know. Oh, you're here for me. Wow. So I found that resonant.
So I think we can wrap up. I want to thank you all for coming out. Thank you